Okay, good. So if we did, welcome everybody and good afternoon to Panado Valter, or a Panad with Pride. My name is Marcel. I'm the chair of the LGBTQ plus network for students and staff at Bangor University. And what we do at the network, it's just a gathering of students and staff that kind of help represent the LGBTQ plus community in different groups around university to ensure that all the policies and strategic plans include the community, and also to create events to celebrate the diversity of Bangor University. One of these celebrations is the Summer Pride. Last year, we managed to get a big rainbow flag in the main building, which was really, really good. And this year, unfortunately, because of the situation, we didn't manage to do that. But we thought it would be a shame to miss the opportunity to celebrate. So we are having some online events. We were part of the virtual Pride that was aired last month, organized by LGBT Cymru. And this event is also recorded and will be shown as part of Pride Cymru 2020, which will happen next week. So if you are missing this, or if you are watching this next week, just welcome to you as well. Today, we've got an invited speaker, which is Dr. Daryl Leeworthy, who is going to tell us a lot about the history of Wales in terms of LGBTQ. And we will also hear about all the things that he has recently discovered about how Bangor changed the world. So without further ado, I'll ask Daryl to start with his talk. The talk will be about half an hour. And then at the end, we will be able to ask, you will be able to ask questions. You can use the chat box to ask questions directly, or if you want, you can wait until the end and then you can ask the questions yourselves. So without further ado, Daryl, I'll click on the presentation start and then you can go for it. Thank you.
Gracias, Marcel. Well, hi everyone. Welcome, croeso, diolch yn fawr iawn am ddod. Thank you for coming. It's a real pleasure for me, actually, to talk today about an aspect of our collective history, about which I've done many hours of research and many more reading, thinking, and writing about it as well. It's an honour, too, to be asked by Marcel and the LGBTQ plus staff network and student network in Bangor to talk about things related to the city and to the university and to Wales as a whole. And all the more so with the platform offered by Pride Cymru as part of their and our big week. So welcome to those viewing it next week from the past. I should also say a big thanks to the Rhys Davies Trust, who sponsored my research and are serving as patrons at the moment, which is a lovely position to be in. And it's a quirky one, because it means that I have the ghosts not only of Rhys Davies, but also of Gertrude Stein and Alice Toklas on my shoulders. So it seems appropriate to be talking about LGBTQ plus history with that background to it all. My theme today is the LGBTQ plus civil rights movement, which is my main area of research in LGBT history. And I think what it does is show us just how far we've come, how we came this far, and what direction we might take in the future. It's also one way of linking local stories to global stories. And it's always nice to be able to see how what happened in our local town connected with that wider diasporic history that we're all part of. And I'll begin, as you can see, with the global themes before moving on to closer to home. And it all begins with the bar behind me at the Stonewall Inn, of course, in June 1969. Now, Stonewall resonates for lots of different reasons. There's that image of Marsha P. Johnson climbing the lamppost and throwing bricks down at the police officers. There's the kick lines singing, "We are the village girls, we wear our hair in curls." And above all, that romance of a confrontation with the oppressor. Stonewall stands, if you like, as the queer equivalent of Independence Day or Bastille Day. But the nuances of the past always make telling that history much more complicated. In America and in the UK, activists had been campaigning about civil rights long before anyone climbed the lamppost in Greenwich Village. There'd been other confrontations too in San Francisco, Philadelphia, and Los Angeles, but these failed to grab the headlines either then or now. We don't really know much about them over here. And so as the historian Eric Marcus, creator of that wonderful Making Gay History podcast, has observed, Stonewall wasn't the first time that gay people fought back against police oppression, or even the second or third time. Nor was the gay liberation movement, which came afterwards, the first attempt to put civil rights onto the public agenda. That responsibility fell to the homophile movements in both countries, which formed in the 1950s. The Mattachine Society, which you can see there, was founded in Los Angeles in 1950, almost 20 years before Stonewall, and was a landmark. It was created by a trade union organizer called Harry Hay. And it grew out of left-wing responses to post-war America. These were the Bernie Sanders supporters of their day, if you like. They pushed back on civil rights, on anti-Red Scare activism, and they saw gay rights and LGBTQ plus rights as being all part and parcel of the same attempt to make America more progressive. And so the Mattachine Society spread around the country to branches in Washington, New York, San Francisco, and so on. And they had four main aims: to unify queer people, to educate everyone, to make queer people more socially aware, and to fight against oppression, very similar to later on. The Society's activities developed such that they produced magazines in the 50s and 60s, and later they had more direct forms of protest, such as the sip-in, which you see in the photograph on the right there. These were often activities inspired by the African American civil rights movement. That has always been the case. So the sip-in in bars in New York followed the sit-ins at lunch counters and, of course, the bus protests that we're more familiar with that took place across the American South as part of the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. But notice they're all wearing suits. You don't find many people in Pride these days wearing a three-piece suit and a tie and a shirt. And that's all because they were supposed to be projecting an image of respectability, that if you wanted society to take you seriously, you had to be respectable. And of course, it wasn't just men who organised, women did too. And here you have the delightfully named Daughters of Bilitis, who were formed in Los Angeles in San Francisco, in 1955. And they were an alternative to going to lesbian bars, which were often raided by police and therefore weren't very safe. And so this was a way of being comfortable, talking about matters relating to sexuality and to gender, and to being part of a national movement again. The Daughters of Bilitis survived up until the time of Stonewall, but fell apart a little bit as the more radical women's liberation movement came along in the 70s. The two organizations worked together. They formed the Reminder Day pickets in Liberty Hall, outside Liberty Hall in Philadelphia, which ran from 1965 to 1969. And these are really the first attempts at having mass gatherings of queer people in protest for civil rights and responsibilities of citizenship and the rights of citizenship. They crossed over, incidentally, with Stonewall. So there was a Reminder Day picket in 1969, but there was not one in 1970 when they tried something different. You'll notice the suits have all gone. Now this looks more like a pride protest that we're more familiar with. It has that more informal, self-expressive character. And that's the distinction. Gone is this idea of trying to be this respectable, suited presentation. Now you can express yourself, have pride in who you are. And that's the distinction. That's what we now celebrate 50 years on. The question is, why should we be interested in what's going on in America? Why does that have anything to do with us? Well, the truth is, as always, the history of America and the history of the UK intertwine on these matters. And this brings us to my second theme, which is the life and times of Tony Dyson. This brings us to Bangor. The story actually doesn't begin in Bangor. As often is the case, it begins somewhere else. And in this case, it begins in Paddington in London. The house, 53 Warlock Road, it's the one next to the light blue coloured house, was the childhood home of Anthony Edward Dyson, known to most people as Tony. The house has no blue plaque. It doesn't even have a rainbow plaque on it. Nothing, therefore, to mark that this is such an important place. But it should. And it's because of this gentleman. Tony Dyson came to Bangor in 1955 as a lecturer in English. He'd thought about becoming a priest and then decided to run away to Bangor, which is a habit that we all have, I suspect. But he'd gone from Cambridge and London to this small part of North Wales where the culture and society was very different to what he was used to. Bangor was easily the smallest place he'd ever lived in. But it was timing that was key. 2 years after he arrived, the Wolfenden Committee released its report. And in 1957, a judge in North Wales declared a group of gay men who'd been arrested to be perverts. And that was reported in the press, and Tony Dyson decided that this can't carry on. And so he took out a piece of paper with the college banner on the heading and began writing a letter. This letter is on the next slide. He sent it to numerous public figures: Clement Attlee, Bertrand Russell, the publisher Victor Golanch, all sorts of figures who he thought would be able to support his ideas. And this is what he wrote. It proved to be the catalyst when it was published on the 7th of March 1958 in the Times to the formation of Britain's first homophile movement after the Second World War, the Homosexual Law Reform Society. Kenneth Walker, the sexologist, became chair, and Tony Dyson became the vice chair, a role he held throughout his time at Bangor University. Now, some people have argued that Tony Dyson put his career on the line when he sent in that letter, but I'm not entirely sure that he did. Undoubtedly, he was very brave, because he'd marshalled prime ministers and philosophers to campaign for something that he believed in. Nor does his intention stop there. He actually used these moral questions in his teaching in Bangor and for his extramural teaching all across North Wales, believe it or not. And he wrote these words in an article a few years later. No one who has learned to read any great literature is likely to be content to label people and things afterwards. This breakdown of simple prejudice is achieved by a heightening, not weakening, of general moral sense. The force of all great literature is to heighten respect for individual freedom and meaningfulness, whilst developing loyalty towards the finest creative achievements and possibilities. So we're looking for a balance between freedom and responsibility, tolerance and standards of human dignity. That's the ideals that lent itself to Tony Dyson's campaigning. The question then arises, how on earth did this all go down in Bangor in the 50s and 60s? Well, we need to pivot to understand that. A few decades after Tony Dyson left North Wales, the Beaumont Society, which is the leading trans representation society in the country, used to hold regular weekends at the Edelweiss Hotel in Colwyn Bay. You'll enjoy their testimonial on the left-hand side there. They were welcome there, and actually one member recalled that the train conductor on the train was like, "Thanks, love," and they got really excited that they'd been accepted as someone for who they are rather than anything else. There have been times earlier, actually, where North Wales presents a culture which we might not necessarily expect, such as in Llandudno in the 30s, where this group of drag entertainers called Roy Cowell's Queries turned up to Happy Valley in Llandudno and became really popular. Their image was used to sell music to local would-be buyers, and they were part, I suppose, of what we might now call a pink pound to some extent, but they're also key members of a wider commercial unit. So no one's afraid, therefore, of using terms like that and looking at drag, actually, as a commercial venture in the 30s. Now, we zoom in, it looks quite conservative. It's not the kind of drag we might be more used to now. It is a seaside entertainment form, but nevertheless, there it is in 1930. That's actually quite late, though. In terms of drag performance, anyone who is familiar with the art form and the culture associated with it, if we go back in time to this photograph of Bobby from 1924, this was taken in a photography studio in Bangor at 234 High Street by the photographer William Aspden. William Aspden moved to Bangor from Bolton in Lancashire and became a kind of broadcaster on the BBC in the 1930s. But there he is taking photographs of drag artists in the 1920s in Bangor. His studio is now something else entirely, but there it is, part and parcel of this history of drag as part of a wider culture. Now, some of the historians who catalogue this call this comedy drag, but actually I think it's quite a brave act. You imagine there are not too many photographs actually surviving of drag artists in Wales from that period. But we can actually wind the clock back even further, and this will surprise people. Here we are in Tuttle Street in Wrexham. And in 1882, Joseph Williams, who was a tailor who lived on Tuttle Street, was arrested for appearing in the streets in full drag, jumping about and, said the police, causing a nuisance. And the reason he was causing a nuisance is because it was Sunday and the chapels were about to empty. And the police were a bit nervous that chapel goers might be surprised at this idea. But when he appeared in court a few weeks later, he presented to the court, Joseph Williams that is, as a respectably dressed young man. Then and now the prejudice of the court meant that he had to choose how to navigate, how to present his gender. And yet, Williams still caused confusion, and we have this wonderful snippet from the court transcript. So the magistrate begins, he says, "The defendant had on his trousers and waistcoat underneath the female dress." He was trying to work out, he couldn't quite fathom it. The clerk then intervenes and says, you could see his trousers down below? Oh, no. And then the person who's made the complaint against Joseph Williams says, no. His skirt was dragging after him as he was tracking down Tuttle Street in Wrexham. Some of that is a humorous side of these responses to gender nonconformity and to gender presentation, but it was all clearly policed. And this is why those rights movements emerged. Which leads me finally to Wales and the idea of changing the world. Lots of the things that I've talked about so far, we've forgotten about, or we've not really been taught about. And it's partly down to the fact that the turbulence of the 60s, 70s, and 80s in particular have masked things that went on before that time. Yet if you look in the press, you find all the things you would expect to find. You'll find cases of sex in cars, in alleyways, in back streets, in public toilets. People cruised each other on promenades and on the pier. But they also faced public anxiety and this confrontation between a radical group, Gay Liberation Front, which incidentally celebrates its 50th anniversary this year in the UK, and their own anxieties. Are we happy to read that 5 homosexuals from the Gay Liberation Front have addressed pupils in a comprehensive school, complained one North Wales newspaper in 1973? and that more such lessons are planned. I haven't actually found out whether the lessons actually took place or not yet. Only a few years earlier, however, a queer bashing case in Llandudno had revolved on the usual gay panic defence. The assailant telling the judge that he'd been discomforted because a known homosexual spoke to him in a public bar. We expect these things to take place, but it's never comfortable when we read them taking place in places we know. But even in the 70s, people were not quite sure about gay liberation as a whole. Michael Johnson, who was a lecturer in German at Bangor University at that time, and he was a local figure in the Gwynedd branch of the Campaign for Homosexual Equality, one of the earlier homophile movements, and in North Wales Friend, which is the advice line service, rejected the ideals of gay liberation. When he stood as a Conservative candidate for Conwy Council in 1979, or rather tried to, he told voters, and this is in the newspaper, gay liberation was a term which can only be applied to extremist movements on the left. He insisted that he was a conservative and respectable. There's that term come back. Not that it really mattered, because Conwy Conservative Party were not really comfortable with the idea of a queer councillor in the first place, and so he was forced to withdraw after a month. And some of his opponents came along and said, well, what would the Tories have the nation do with homosexuals? Lock them up in an institution and pretend that they are not there? I mean, if you asked a few these days, they might even give you that answer too. The reality, of course, is that in the 70s, North Wales and South Wales had begun to develop a landscape of pubs and clubs familiar in tone to us today, if not an exact location. North Wales Friend, the local equivalent of Switchboard, had launched in 1977 because there was an absence of advice and support from other services. Lesbian Line followed a couple of years later when they realised that actually women deserved even more specialised support in their advice. And the HIV/AIDS advice lines followed in suit. And I tell you all of these things because it complicates the timeline and the history and the picture that we have of where we've come from and how we've got to where we are today. The timeline stretches back into the past much further than we realise. That the landmark dates that we're now familiar with, 1999, beginning of Pride Cymru as it is today, 1985, that first Pride March in Cardiff, 1971, when there was actually a Pride protest of sorts in Cardiff, organised by the local branch of the GLF. These are staging posts or waymarkers of our story, but it's longer than that. So why is it then that we've lost sight of those things? On this, we can speculate, and this is where I want to bring my concluding remarks to. It goes back to that original motivation, to think about Bangor as a place which changed the world and made it a little bit more rainbow. Now, Tony Dyson could have gone to a lecturing job at any other institution. He had a double first from Cambridge. He could have walked into most posts at that time. And yet he chose to come to Bangor. And he came to Bangor at just the right moment. Not every university would have accepted either his intervention into the public debate on homosexuality in the 50s or his continued intervention in that debate on civil rights through into the 60s, when he was vice chairman of Britain's primary homophile movement. That is an element of the story to cherish, particularly for those of you from Bangor University. And it helps to us extend Wales's contribution to the transformation of civil rights in Britain as a whole. That we were there at the beginning, which is always a nice thing to say. Moreover, Tony Dyson's ongoing work reminds us that the liberation, with its confrontations and its informality, is much more exciting than perhaps some of the earlier parts of our story are. Those parts are part of the totality of that history, and we need to kind of reconcile them to our understanding. It also shows that what happened in Britain in the 50s and 60s ran in parallel with events in America rather than were informed by events in America. And that's important too. It means that we can take part in that conversation as part of a global story. There is more that I can say about Tony Dyson and about his fascinating relationships with poets like Tom Gunn, who became the kind of poet laureate of queer experience in the 1980s, and more closely to home to R.S. Thomas, who you would have thought would be a curmudgeonly old man and not therefore interested in some of the things that Tony Dyson was interested. And yet they came together on this question of Christian faith. And that's an aspect that is easily ignored, I think. In the end, I suppose I'll come to this point, that we are, as a group, possessed of a rich and endlessly fascinating collective history. And if we know the world that we've won because we continue to live in it, as Geoffrey Weeks has said, the question is to educate ourselves about how we got to this point and where we might take our story in the future. And that's always what interests me, and that's part of the reason for becoming a historian of these things. And who knows, perhaps one day, even in the archives in that college on the hill that we see behind us, we may find the document that says that in a certain year, a kickline formed in the high street and sang, "We are the Bangor girls, we wear our hair in curls, we wear our dungarees above our Nelly knees." And if not, perhaps one day someone will make it so. Diolch yn fawr iawn i chi gyd. Thank you.
Your mic's off.
Noob error.
I was thinking everything was perfectly fine. So thank you so much, Daryl, for your presentation. What I'm going to do now is I'll stop sharing your presentation, if that's okay. So everybody can There you go. Everybody can see everybody. And then if anyone would like to ask any questions, you can either use the chat option, or you can ask to unmute or wave at me, or I'm not entirely sure how these work. But if you can just type in there, then Daryl can answer your questions. So I'll give a few seconds in case people want to start asking.
Daryl, can I ask a question?
By all means, go for it.
Thank you very much again. I enjoyed your talk that you gave last time, and it's really good to kind of hear some other parts of the story. I just wondered what you'd learned since writing the book about kind of North Wales. Have you learned anything more about?
Yeah, I think there's... The thing that I've learned about it is that there's a different rhythm to what, as anyone who lives in that part of the world knows, there is a different rhythm to it. But there's also these similarities, which makes that story much more compelling in some ways. What was it like for Tony Dyson? What was it actually like for those men who were in that court case, which then prompted him to act, at that time? What was it like for the women who organised those early lesbian support groups? And what was it like for those trans visitors who were told, off you go to a hotel in North Wales, and like, are you sure we should be going to that part of the world? Just because that prejudice exists where people are unfamiliar. They think of rural areas, particularly seasides, being more conservative and therefore not as tolerant. That's been the eye-opening thing, researching more and more about what was going on up in North Wales, and particularly in Bangor and the region around it, coming to an understanding which has almost made me want to go back to the book and rewrite some of it, and to try and balance the more readily accessible histories for Cardiff and Swansea with this other reality, which is life in Northwest Wales. And there's this bit of it that I left out of the talk, but because I don't really have enough evidence for it as yet, but it prompts me to think about it a lot, which is, there you have the main trunk road linking the port in Holyhead to Dublin and going along through to England with the trucks and things like that. Now, we know in America that truckers are a big part of this story, and yet look in British histories and Irish histories to a lesser extent, they're not really part of the story, and yet it strikes me they must be. There's this big long road, you've been on the road for hours, surely there's part of the story there. And importantly, in America, it's not just male truckers, it's women as well. And that's really a nice way of thinking about the relationships between class, work, place, and cultural expectations that people have. So hopefully, at some point, there'll be a second edition, and I'll be able to beef up the North Wales elements of this. Or, and this is where I'm coming at it now, is that there's a book about North Wales as a discrete area, and it deserves that sort of idiosyncratic history to be told on its own terms. And I think that's really where I'm coming at it now. And that's what I've learned, really, from engaging with you guys up north and talking about these things and hearing your own perspectives on how it relates to your own lives now, and then thinking about how the present connects to the past and joining up those dots. So it's almost turning me into a North Wales historian, which most people will be surprised at.
That's great. That's great. Since listening to your talk last time and reading the book, just speaking to people in the community, there is so many stories that seem to kind of come out of that, and that need to be told. And whether that's in the book or whether that's kind of by presenting that in the community at some point in the future, it just I think it's kind of lighted a spark to a lot of people. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Yard.
Can I ask a question, if that's okay? If you can hear me?
Yeah.
Hey, first of all, thank you very much for a great talk. Great to connect to things like this when we don't have physical pride and things of that nature. So I was wondering, you spoke about influences from the States. You talked about Dyson coming from London, and of course, potentially the most famous recent popular portrayal of gay life in Wales is the film Pride, which is about people from London influencing Welsh culture. And also the Wolfenden report, or at least the Wolfenden committee minutes seem to, with regards to homosexuality, mostly seem to talk about homosexuality in the metropole. I can't recall them talking about Welsh stuff, but maybe you've seen it. But I was wondering, to what extent was there kind of a friction in terms of what might be seen as interlopers coming in and forcing this sort of discourse upon people who, might have had their own traditions with regards to same-sex desire, but didn't really, interpret it through the lens that these social movements were doing, or that the Wolfenden report was doing. So to what extent was there a friction in terms of these maybe external forces coming into Wales and telling them how same-sex desire should be interpreted and what the laws should be, things of that nature?
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. The Wolfenden Committee material is really interesting because the main deliverer of evidence was the Chief Constable of Glamorgan, but he was appearing on behalf of the Association of Chief Constables, so he wasn't really delivering any Welsh material. The conflict which we see on the screen in Pride in the film is somewhat manufactured in that sense, in that they didn't really, when they came to London, from London to Onshloen, they weren't, and the wider community, so they weren't really meeting with the miners per se. They were meeting with the women's committee. And that is always a smoother relationship, as often we find in the way these community groups engage. But the reality is that the London LGSM weren't the only ones that were engaged. There was a group from Southampton that came to the colliery and community around Abercynon near Pontypridd in the south as well. And there were other sort of local groups collecting in Cardiff and Swansea and going into the valleys and providing that support. So those things were really the quirk of 1984-5 is they needed the money to be able to live, and so they were willing to kind of, if they had any qualms, set them aside there. So I think that's the idiosyncratic nature of that moment. But with Dyson and others, where they're coming in, they're having these conversations, and much like Todd was saying in his question there and his observations, is that we've had these thoughts, but no one's really talked to us about them. This is new for us. This is quite exciting. And that's something we often forget, is that everybody knew someone, because you can't really not know somebody. And therefore you have to come to terms with the kind of working class live and let live. And that's really a prevailing wind. There's a character in the book called Tom Davis, and he becomes a drag artist for the Folies Bergère in the 20s and 30s, and he's brilliant. And his dad is a chapel minister, and you think of all these things, the chapel minister would be the one who might be conservative and find it a little uncomfortable that his young son, who's the only son he's got left, his older son died, is the one who likes dressing up his sister's clothes and insists that whenever they bought anything new that he tries it on first. But he wasn't. All he was mostly afraid was the fact that his son might go drinking a lot and therefore get caught up in that alcoholic lifestyle, chapel ministers and temperance being the key there. So I think the direct answer to the question, Jacob, is that a lot of the things that we concern ourselves with now are anxieties that we are projecting backwards sometimes, because we expect that to be the case, because to some extent it is the case now. So many of us move to bigger cities. We move from small places, provincial towns, whatever, to metropolitan areas, and we know that that's true in America as it is in Britain as well. And therefore, when we look back, we think, "Oh, we must leave it. We must leave some of that culture behind." And if we go home, we must leave some of the culture we have developed in the metropolitan areas behind there and present in different ways. The reality is, as talking to the guys from and gals from LGSM, they said, well, actually, we just were able to get along and it was fine. And we were all a bit nervous the first time we went, but actually we discovered that we had more in common than we didn't. And we were able to set aside some of our anxieties. Whereas the people who were writing letters into the press in London from areas of working class areas of the country, going, you can't deal with the miners. They used to be the people who kicked our heads in when we were in school. They weren't going home. And so therefore they didn't have that conversation, they didn't have that discussion. And so the anxiety was built up in their heads about it. And that's reflected, I think, back into the histories. And the more we write about provincial areas and regional areas and areas of the country which are not necessarily metropolitan, the more we can challenge that anxiety, both in terms of historiographical evidence and in terms of our own social conduct today, that actually, we have more in common than we don't in the past and the present.
Thank you, Darryl. Are there any more questions for Darryl? You can unmute yourselves or ask in the chat box. Whilst you think about it, I've got a question for you, and it is quite surprising, or might be surprising for some, that when you hear about the LGBTQ plus history of Wales, you expect to hear about the ladies of Llangollen or the Marquis of Anglesey, because they're kind of like the rich and famous. And you, in your book, you kind of focus on the not rich and famous, and as you said, the truckers or the migrants or miners, teachers, etc. but that must come with a big challenge as a researcher, because obviously there's less. How do you research on that? Because the rich and famous usually go on books, but not the people kind of behind scenes.
Yeah, this is partly why the book is more focused on South Wales than the North, not just because of distance in terms of reaching archives, but because the archives in Cardiff contain photographic material, which has been really useful. The danger lies in the fact that the best source for the early 20th century and the late 19th century are police records and court records. So we get an unfortunate image, therefore, of people who are put in positions that they didn't deserve to be put in. But because of wider habits and wider hostilities, so for instance, the police in Cardiff were very hostile towards migrants, you therefore start to pick out the diversity of what we would now think of as a community. And so you do get not just local lads or local women who are cruising or whatever. You get the people that they picked up or were picked up by, who would come in off merchant vessels from the Middle East, from Africa, from America, and so on. And that's what enables you to write a history that looks like people like us, rather than looks like people who lived in big castles. And that's going to be a trouble sometimes. People are like, well, but the ladies of Llangollen are really important. Well, they are, but they're also not representative of very much. They don't represent the general population in their own time, let alone the very small percentage of people that we might be able to identify. But it's always going to be a smaller percentage than the real percentage of people who would fall under the umbrella of LGBTQ plus now. And that's as hard in the 20th century as it is in the 18th and 19th centuries. And so when people were first doing this, they did look at the rich and famous. They did look at the people who were easy to find, because that gave them something to talk about. But the more we look into the archives, the more that archives come through, the more that people realize that depositing their own materials is important, that their own life stories are important, the more we're able to tell those wider histories. If you think about it today, how would you tell the history of LGBTQ plus history in the 21st century? What sources would you look at? You might look at newspapers, might look at television and media, you might look, if you're really lucky, for a diary, but how many of us actually keep one? And how much of that diary is honest about the thoughts and feelings and things that we've been doing, as opposed to, I went to the shops today, I did this, I did that. We don't have those stories for our own times, so we can't really expect them of the past. But you gain an instinct. So in those crime records, for instance, you start to get the names of people. And so you can start digging around there. You are then able to think about the language that newspapers used. They didn't ever use drag, they always used male or female impersonator. And you can put that in. Sometimes you'll find that those impersonators were married and had kids, and so therefore actually for them it is literally a job. But for other people, they're not married and they don't have kids, they don't have those relationships. So we can start to think more broadly then and use our instincts. And actually, that's part of the reason why I think a lot of people who research these areas are themselves LGBTQ plus or fall into those categories, because the research they're doing relies on a certain historiographical instinct that you kind of get a sense of what's going on. So I found people sending in adverts to look for roommates. They were like, and the way they're composed is like, so-and-so has a bed and bathroom and would like to share it with another. That sort of thing would be innocuous to anybody else, but you read it and you go, okay, I see what they're looking for in those contexts. And it's because in later years you get Lonely Hearts ads in the 70s and 80s. And it's the same sort of thing. But people had to use the newspapers in different ways in the 1890s. And you just have to learn how to read those sources. And the next step is then to tell somebody else so that they can read them as well. And so the tips and tricks are kind of in the book as well.
Nice, thank you. Are there any more questions for
Marcel? Could I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, Daryl, it's Jenny Ann from the Unique Transgender Network in North Wales, and I was interested in your comments about what we might call the concert parties in Llandudno. I don't know if you were aware there was also a cross-dressing football team in Llandudno, mainly composed of the hotel staff, who were often gay people. And right along the coastal strip of North Wales, nearly all the theatres had concert parties or female impersonators. And where I live in Rhyl, the local team were so successful, they bought the theatre and performed for something like 20 or 30 years. And in the holiday camps in the 60s, 70s, we had Topsy-Turvy Thursday, where everybody swapped clothes, which was a great opportunity for trans people and non-binary people. And I think what that did was it made the coastal strip much more accepting of gender diversity. So when I came to live in North Wales, I had very little discrimination, and I live very happily in North Wales.
That's fantastic, Jenny Ann. Thank you. That's probably put a smile on everybody's face. I can only see 4 people, but I'm sure the others in the room have the smiles on their faces as well. It's exactly that. It is. It's although sometimes those hotels and those theatres are stereotypes, but yeah, those stereotypes have an element of truth to them. And those transgressive or different gender presentations in the past are so ephemeral that now we have a recording, so thank you. But they are so ephemeral that it's almost entirely lost, except to popular memory, except to people going, oh yeah, I remember this, I remember that. I would love to, to talk to someone who might have gone along to the Edelweiss Hotel on one of those conferences.
I did.
Did you? Aha, wonderful.
In fact, we took over the Edelweiss Bells, and that's where Unique met for many years until they pulled down the hotel and built residential flats for older people.
Wow. There we go. So I know where to come. Next time I'm up in North Wales and doing research, I know who to call on.
Please do. You'll find us online at Unique. Just look up Unique North Wales.
Will do. Thanks, Jenny Ann.
Thank you.
Marcel, may I ask a question? Sorry. Yeah. It's my pal, David or Cagrant, David from Cambridge. I taught at the university in the 90s.
Oh, yeah.
And was also an HIV outreach worker for the health department. And my question to you, Darren, is I didn't know about this history of Bangor, and I'm delighted to learn it, so thank you. But my question to you is, as an incomer and a Welsh learner, it became very clear to me that a lot of my facility was through the university's liberal culture. But when I supported men from the local culture whose first language was Welsh, it was a very different story. Their experience was very different, and their comfort around their gayness was very different. And I just wondered whether you had anything to say around the Welsh-speaking population of North Wales, because often it's not so apparent in the university ambience.
Yeah, thanks, David. That's an interesting one. This does crop up, and what happens often is people will ring very far away. They'll ring down to Cardiff, for instance, because that proximity is so small. People, they had that anxiety about being found out. And so particularly in some of the themes that you would have been involved in the 90s there, I found in the logbooks of South Wales Friend, actually, people ringing down from Bangor and Anglesey and Carnarvon and so on, ringing down to Cardiff and going, we couldn't talk to anybody at home. Is there a Welsh speaker on the line that we can talk to? And therefore they had to have Welsh speakers on the South Wales Friend, which was not so much in demand, to be honest, down here as it would be in the north. And they had to have those as part of that advice to be able to provide advice, therefore, to people ringing down in situations where they felt that they had no local connections in North West Wales, particularly. If you were in Wrexham, for example, you could go across the border into Chester and other places, which was quite common. And I found people ringing down going, we don't really know what to do. What's the advice that you have for being safe around HIV/AIDS in the 80s and 1990s? And I found this one story of this one 18-year-old ringing down from Anglesey to Cardiff going, well, we've had all this advice. So if we use the contents of our various utensils in different ways, will we be safe? And the people in South Wales going, I'm not really sure how we reply to this question, except insofar as clearly they're not getting the right advice. And it's because, as you say, you had that anxiety of who on earth do you ask and how do you get that advice to you in a language that you understand, which is key. And the networks therefore had to work together to provide national support in that respect, when in fact very often these things were parallel. So there was a North Wales equivalent and a South Wales equivalent, and they didn't talk to each other. There weren't pan-Wales organisations until very recently, and therefore you weren't sure who you could talk to. You weren't sure what kind of advice you could get without then leading you down a path of all your other anxieties you might have about being found out, talking to people who might not accept you, this perception perhaps that the community might be more conservative than you might expect, and all those other anxieties. But it's true down here in the valleys with English speakers as well. So it's that sort of anxiety is common to the two languages, but it's because of a certain sort of class orientation and not being certain about living in small communities and having your business, as it were, plastered everywhere. You might have that anxiety. But I think, there's a lot more work to be done, I think, around these more complex questions of the interaction, that intersection between language, anxiety, community, class, and gender and sexual orientation and presentation, and the ways in which those discussions are being had in different parts. But those are conversations we need to start having within ourselves as well, because it's quite, the sources are not really there. So it then becomes an oral discussion. And again, we start running into the same problems, don't we? Where are people comfortable talking about the anxieties they might once have had when they were younger? The older you get, sometimes you don't really care as much, but nevertheless, if it was painful, you might still have those anxieties around. But there are others up in North Wales. I know, talking to folks in Bangor when I was up in February, who started to have these discussions as well, because they're still current. And still an extent of, well, do I not just have to move? Is that not part and parcel of the story that I have of my life there? So thanks, David.
Thanks, David.
Can we ask a quick one?
Yeah, we've got time for one more question.
Yeah. Can I? Hi, Diolch, thank you again for a great talk. It's great to hear Bangor having a positive impact. I moved to Bangor and came out here because for me it was quite the opposite. Coming from a big metropolitan city, I didn't feel like I could be me. Moving here, I felt I could. But I think my question to you would be, as a proud member of the non-binary community, did you come across us much in your research? Because I know researching myself, we're often seen as quite invisible, especially because the label is relatively new. So I was just wondering if you came across much about the non-binary community and history in Wales.
Not as much, for all the reasons that you say, Owen. That's the challenge, in that even 20 years ago, those concepts were less widespread, and so the language is not as generally used, and therefore it's more difficult to find. What you're looking for is instinct, and it's exactly that. And that if you looked at a source, for instance, as being part of a non-binary community, as you say, you'll read it in a way that goes, hang on a minute, that sounds familiar. This is telling me something, in a way that someone who isn't or doesn't share those same sentiments or feelings may not have the same instincts. So basically, this is my call for more historians of these matters, which isn't to pass the buck in any shape or form. It's literally that archival instinct is really something you can't teach anybody. I can't teach you how to be you, can I? And you can teach me some of it, but there's still that element of there's something I'm missing, which you're seeing, that you have to point out to me directly. The further back in time we go, the more those instincts become really essential. And so when I was looking for, as I say, those personal ads in the 1890s, it was instinct that taught me what they were saying, rather than any kind of professional training as to how to read a source. Others will have looked at them and gone, oh, well, that doesn't tell me anything, I'm just going to move on. And so it's a case that we'd all have to sort of sit in the archives at some point and look at similar sources and go, well, okay, what do we see? What do you see? What do I see? What do they see? And work out what the instincts that we have is telling us. And that's part of the reason why I think as I say, LGBTQ plus history is written mostly by people within the community, is those instincts are so essential. It's also, of course, why, because professional history is generally done by male academics, because they're the ones who, luckily, with all the privilege that get in the posts and therefore have all the money to do this research, not that I need to tell anyone that, means that their instincts come to the top of the list, which is the battle that anyone who goes into these fields will always face, unfortunately. But you will see things, I think, Owen, that I might miss and that others might miss. And so that's where your instincts become really important. And other non-binary scholars and researchers will see things too. And that's where it becomes really important. I think the really fascinating work, for instance, on trans history has come out because people within the trans community are looking at the sources and going, hang on, how on earth did you miss this? It's so obvious. You can do the same, and that'll be the thing where you can take my place and I can sit here listening to you, and that'll be a day which I think will be really important. So I look forward to it. You'll get there, and hopefully you'll be able to correct some of the things that I've missed at some point as well, which would be cool.
Nice, thank you. Tide wanted to just ask one more question, so I think
it was just a kind of thought, really. It was I wonder what a historian looking back at now and looking what support there is for LGBT people in rural Wales, what they would think, kind of, because listening to your book, reading your book, seeing how much support, when I say support groups that there was for LGBT people, and living in North Wales now, knowing that there's little to none. And I wondered, will they think that it's we've got to the stage where everything's fine? Or will they kind of think to themselves, actually, why is there still not those groups about to be challenging some of the issues that we all come across in North Wales?
Yeah, I find that as well. Yeah, this is where the North and the valleys come together, and that I look at the past and I go, crikey Moses, there were GLF branches in Bangor and in Aberystwyth and in Merthyr Tydfil, and I wonder how on earth we never knew about those and they disappeared. Obviously GLF was very short-lived. It kind of dissipated everywhere, and within a couple of years it became something else. But nevertheless, those instincts were there in the early 70s in every place, and then went. What David was saying earlier, it was a university connection, really, but the fact that there was one in Merthyr suggests that it doesn't have to be. What it shows is that as things become more and more acceptable, and the legal position is much more calm, if you like, that's a word of calm at the moment, everything becomes very similar. This is the life that you lead if you are part of this community. And yet, when it wasn't, when the legal situation was different, people were like, well, no, we're where we are. We've got to deal with things on our own terms here. That's why the rural question was more prominent, perhaps. If you didn't organise, there was nothing. Whereas now, people's like, oh yeah, you just log online and it's all there, and yeah, it might just tell you what's going on in Paddington or Soho or in Cardiff if you're lucky. And that's what we're kind of missing as things become more and more open and more legally balanced. We lose some of that oppressive force, which is what creates the opposite reaction, that Newtonian idea that if you have a force of oppression, you have to have a force pushing back against it. And that has a reiteration in every community. And those in rural areas, or quasi-rural areas like Bangor, which has got that kind of sort of urban centre, they felt it necessary to push back. And that was really important. And it's retreated to some extent, hasn't it, to the university campus now. Yeah. So university organisation is really strong amongst students and staff, as we've seen today. But step out into the rural areas. If you went to Blaenau Ffestiniog, for instance, it would be very much lacking, I would think.
Yeah. I think that's where the frustration lies, I think, because we set up a social group in January for North Wales LGBT people. And one of the things that we've found is that kind of people want to connect. They want to come offline and there's still that willingness to push back because services don't meet the needs of LGBT people, but there's not the group to come together to there isn't the group at the moment to come together to kind of push that forwards. But I suppose that kind of means that some of us have to start something new, really, again.
Yeah, it falls to us, generation after each generation. It falls to some of us to take it on, either as to write a story or to be the activist that someone else will in the future write the story about.
Yeah,
and the other element of this is why they organised as CHE Gwynedd. This is why they organised as North Wales this or North Wales that, because they realised that if they just focused on the university town, and there was only one in North Wales at that time in the 60s, they would have only reached what they would have expected to be the more liberal parts of the population in the first place. Now, that doesn't always pan out. Students are not always the most liberal people on the planet, but that was the expectation. That university students would be more open. But they organised on regional levels and said, no, we have to organise because there are more people out there that we're going to miss if we only focus on an urban centre. And maybe that's the way around it, is to go and flip it on its head and say, well, actually, the urban centre is going to look after itself. It's the rural areas that we need to focus on. There was, incidentally, the Gay Rural Aid Information Network, GRAIN, in the 70s, and its headquarters, believe it or not, was in North Wales, in Colwyn Bay. They tried to do exactly this, but they were a national network, so they dealt with the whole of the UK. Perhaps some of the lessons of them is to come back and go, well, actually, there are many ways of living, and this is something that people always struggle with as well, that there are many ways to be LGBTQ+. It doesn't just have to be one form. And actually, you can exist in however you like, wherever you happen to live. And there are plenty of people who are living in similar circumstances to you who would love a conversation. As you know, setting up the network where people want those conversations. But it's taking that chance, isn't it? It's taking that risk that you might only be talking to the people you know. But that's something rather than nothing. And it'll grow because I think people want it to be there as well.
Thank you.
No, anytime, Todd.
Thank you so much, Darryl. And then, Tide, as well, one of the issues that we keep having in our network meetings is how do we kind of include that community as well, not just keep it within the university. And I think examples like the talk today really show how much kind of room there is for improvement, and the fact that we've got here staff, students, people from the local community. And I think that's something that's really worth exploring. But we've only been in here for a year now, so I think as time goes by, we can organise and do more things together, definitely. A few people have asked how do we contact or how do we know about these events. We've got a website at the university. I'll just put it there on the chat, and the video recording of this session will be available there as well. So Teresa, you were asking, and a couple have asked as well, whether this will be available. Because this is part as well of Pride Cymru 2020, which is going to happen next week. We will wait for a week to put it in our website, but then after that, the video will be available. If you want to actually have access to the video itself, you can always ask the LGBTQ plus network, which has got the following email: lgbtq@bangor.ac.uk. So if any of you would like to get in touch with Darryl, or if you want to ask any questions, suggest any collaborations with us, please let us know. Some of you have asked about the book as well. I've got it here. It's called A Little Gay History of Wales. And I've copied the link in our chats as well. So if you have a look in the chat, you will be able to find it there. It's really good and really interesting. So diolch fawr iawn to everybody who joined us today, especially to Darryl for sharing all this with us. We will be organizing more talks for LGBTQ plus History Month, which is in February. So please keep an eye out. We will be promoting more things soon. So thank you so much, Dichor, and thank you all for joining today as well.
Thank you, Darryl.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye. And to Liz as well for all the signing.
Yes.